Welcome to Security and GRC Decoded, the podcast where security, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, CISOs, executive leaders, and practitioners can stay ahead of industry trends and challenges. I'm your host, Raj Krishnamurthy, founder of Compliance Co. Join us twice a month to bring you expert insights, actionable strategies, and real-world stories to elevate your security, governance, risk, and compliance programs. Each week, we decode the complexities of GRC to help you make smarter decisions and drive innovation in your organization. Let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome. Hey. Welcome to another episode of Security and GRC Decoded. I'm Raj Krishnamurthy, your host. And today we have the fantastic Kieran with us today as our guest. Kieran is responsible for GRC and security at Whatnot and has led security and compliance engineering and assurance programs at companies like Cruise, Dropbox, and Ernst & Young. Kieran, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Raj. Pleasure to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation today. And thank you for having me.
So let's start with something we ask our guests this question all the time. Let's start with something controversial, right? What is one controversial opinion that you hold on security and GRC, Kieran?
Yeah, my controversial opinion is that the data security or data protection side of security has become a lot less relevant over time, and I say that meaning that I think the platform protection sort of availability side of security has become a lot more critical. You know, when I think about risks that a company faces, the things that get the most attention from executives and have the most immediate revenue impacting potential are around the site or service being down and customers not being able to use it. And I feel like that's really become priority number one, whereas all of our data, don't get me wrong, I think it's important, but the reason it's a controversial opinion is all of our data has been through so many breaches at this time that we've become a little bit immune or the notifications have become so commonplace that it's almost who cares, right? When you get another notification, who cares that your email is breached again, or that an old password that you're using for some site is breached. I just sort of delete those emails and move along, right? But when a site is down, if I can't use something, or if a company can't generate revenue, that's what draws attention. That's what security teams I think really need to be protecting against.
No, that's a very interesting viewpoint. It is definitely controversial. So what I'm hearing you say, in fact, we had one of our other guests that came on the call, and he said the exact opposite of what you're saying, right? But what I'm hearing you say is that in a world where we assume breach, right, data is out there, and you're not saying it is not critical, but what you're saying is that it is far more important that we understand the nuances, how we build these systems from an availability and resiliency perspective, rather than this very religious focus on data.
Yeah, exactly. I think a data breach is absolutely going to affect every company, and that's not definitely, I'm not saying that it won't, but it definitely affects companies to different degrees, particularly if you are a critical service that companies can't really move off of very well. I don't know, I'll pick on Workday as an example. It's a big HRIS that if they had a breach, I just realistically don't see that many companies ripping out Workday and replacing it. But if Workday is down, suddenly your onboarding systems don't work, terminations don't work. There's a lot of things you can put in Workday. Different companies do it different ways, but payroll might be in Workday, right? It's suddenly a really big deal if the service isn't available. Similarly, I don't know if you look at Amazon, that's more of a B2C example, but Amazon, if all of my order history on Amazon was breached and made public, I'd be okay, whatever. But if Amazon.com doesn't work and I can't buy things, even for 10 minutes, that's millions and millions of revenue impact for a company of Amazon size. So Yeah, I mean that's kind of my point. Is like that's where I think the like real scale and impact comes in is when your service isn't available because of some cybersecurity issue, and that should be given a lot of weight when doing like risk assessments. So.
Got it. Let's talk about you, Kieran. How did you start your career in security and compliance?
Yeah, I feel like I sort of wound up here by accident, but I've had a lot of fun doing it over the years. So I've leaned into it and kept doing it. I in college I studied in information systems, business information systems, and wound up working for EY, one of the big four, doing like a lot of SOC 2 audits, SOX audits, this sort of stuff. And while like I enjoyed doing the external side, it definitely wasn't what I wanted to do forever. So I looked for an opportunity to jump internal at Dropbox, spend some time at Dropbox, which was like an awesome experience. And Dropbox had a relatively mature security program, security compliance program at the time. So, a lot of that was just like seeing how a well put together program runs and like getting the opportunity to contribute to that. Um, wasn't too long until I felt like I really wanted to like build something myself, which is why I jumped to Cruise pretty early on in Cruise's journey and was able to really build their security GRC program from the ground up. And then, similarly doing something here for Whatnot. And yeah, just as my career has progressed, I found that I really enjoy GRC as like an intersection of people problems and like technology or security problems, and like that's what I have fun doing, is like kind of solving that intersection of people and technology, and yeah, and it's truly been like a fun career so far.
Okay. You said something also interesting at Dropbox, right? You did something on incident response management. Am I saying this right? Is that what you
Yeah,
did?
yeah,
What was that about, and how did that intersect with GRC?
yeah. That, to be frank, like there wasn't a ton of overlap. But what it was I was running Dropbox's business incident response program. So when there was some engineering issue where we needed to reach out to customers to tell them about the issue, either we accidentally deleted some data, or there was corruption in some file, or I don't know, there's a freeze on their account, whatever it might be. I like kind of ran the team or program that was responsible for coordinating the response from legal and marketing and comms and customer support and all these different functions to make sure that we, are reaching out to the customer and kind of treating it with a unified voice and making sure everyone, was in the loop there. And yeah, it sort of wound up on my plate as a function within legal. At Dropbox, the GRC team was actually within legal rather than within like security engineering. But yeah, it wound up on my plate, and I had a lot of fun doing that. It was really cool, but not like there wasn't a ton of overlap with like traditional GRC work there. Yeah, I would say what I really appreciate about that experience, though, is like now at Whatnot, we're such a small team that I find myself, on call for like frontline incidents again.
Mm.
Um, and and that experience is really helpful because I've been through that incident process for customer facing incidents quite a bit, and was able to just pick it up very easily here because I've done it a lot in the past. So
Does that help you? As you said, there is no overlap, but GRC tends to be mostly an inside facing function. And given your experience around incident management, has that helped you, or does that help you in any way on how you think about GRC?
yeah, I mean, I think it keeps you really grounded with the customer, right? With the customer experience, what the customer faces, the like real life problems that subsets of customers are running into. Um, and that's all just, I think, just helpful probably in any role, but like within GRC, as you're thinking about like risks, it's helpful to keep in mind like what the customer experience really is. And yeah, and also as you're thinking about, okay, where do we want to like take a compliance program, what might be important, if customers are complaining about a lot of availability incidents. Maybe that's a good like segue or pitch into adding like availability criteria into a SOC too.
Yeah,
So I think those sorts of angles are
got it.
are
I,
helpful.
I, I have a very strong feeling that the controversial opinion that you start to do this very much informed based on what you've seen in the field, right? And I think that's very interesting. So this creates customer empathy, and I don't know who talks about customer empathy in GRC, but that's a very fresh perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think again, I know I've said it. I don't want to say that protecting data isn't important because customers, I think customer empathy and caring about the customer is still very valid and important for their data. Safeguarding their data is very important. But yeah, it's like the true frustrations come out when they can't use your product at all. So yeah.
As a compliance engineer and leader, what is your view of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance?
Yeah, I feel like GRC, a couple of things. I feel like GRC should be like one and the same with security. Like, I don't think they should be viewed as two separate functions. I mentioned earlier Dropbox had GRC on the legal team. And while there were some advantages to that, mainly that being like when compliance or GRC asks for something, when it sort of has like the weight of legal behind it, it's often easier to get things done, or like you can align priorities more quickly. That was nice, but having been on teams where it's within legal and within security, I prefer for it to be within security, because I think GRC and security work really well, like hand in hand. GRC and security to me is like GRC is the kind of like scaffolding that all the other teams can use to mature, level up, build their organizations. GRC I think is the one function that truly sees across all the other domains of security, right? Like GRC is the function that has requirements or controls or processes to understand, how AppSec should function, how detection and response should function, infrastructure security, corporate engineering and employee endpoints, right? All these sorts of things. Whereas, all the other groups, sure, like they have a, general knowledge of all of security, but tend to stay within their own areas. And so, yeah, I see like GRC is the kind of like glue or like a connector bridge across all these different subdomains of security that kind of has the holistic picture of what a security program should look like. And when you lean on GRC like properly, they really can like, use the scaffolding example again, be the scaffolding for the other teams to reference and work towards. So.
Got it. And how do you think others perceive GRC, others in the organization, whether it is your leadership team, whether it is the other business units that you deal with, how do they perceive GRC?
Yeah, well, I think it can vary wildly based on the organization. I've seen GRC be perceived as a like necessary thing, but very evil or like a pain, essentially.
Necessary evil.
Yes, a necessary evil, but not one that anybody enjoys or like really wants to deal with. And I've seen people's attitudes be like they're essentially like useless paper pushers, and and they exist because some legal requirement or like a insurance agency requires it, this sort of stuff. And I understand where those trains of thoughts like comes from and how those originate, absolutely, because I think in its worst form GRC can be like that, but it also can be so great, right? Like GRC can be like truly a hub of like knowledge and best practice and like hands-on work to help all the other like security domains help like product implement security better, all of these sorts of things. And so yeah, so I'd say like I've also seen security be viewed, or GRC specifically, right, be viewed as a huge value add for security and for the organization. And maybe we'll get more into this later, but I think when you can position it as a as a valuable thing tied to business development or business objectives, that's really where you start to see that value, and ensure that the GRC teams are, valued or seen how, for their best. Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I was going to ask you the question in terms of how do you think we can change the perspectives for the better? I think some part you already answered, but anything more you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think the like core idea underpinning it that is making sure GRC is seen as a profit center and not a cost center, essentially, right? Position GRC to be seen as a function that drives new business, not as just a function that you have to pour money into to keep the business afloat. And what I mean by that is like working closely with sales or business development to understand like what target markets the company is trying to target, what customers the company might be trying to go after, and understand what compliance objectives may help them unlock that market. That may be something like SOC 2 or ISO, but you can get more specific. Like the German automotive market is based off of TSAX, right? And so maybe that's something sales has come up against, but they've always been shot down because nobody's considered TSAX before. So it's a good example of like, okay, work with sales and see if you can essentially unlock a new market for the business to target. I use PCI is probably the easiest example there, where you have to have PCI if you want to be able to accept payment cards. That's a clear revenue driver of like GRC has unlocked or like maintains the ability for the company to collect credit cards. That's a huge like revenue driver, revenue enablement function. And anyways, I think all of that is important because the more you can show that GRC is tied to revenue growth, then you unlock much easier time of getting budget, getting headcount, just getting visibility that you need at the company to make your initiative successful.
Okay. And I think that's a very interesting point you're saying. So you're saying it is not a cost center. It has to be looked at from a profit center perspective, which helps you with unlocking deals, right? Getting into new markets, penetrating, so on and so forth. But what does that mean for GRC practitioners, Kieran? Do they do enough for compliance so that they can sort of unlock some of these opportunities? Are there more things that they have to do from a security perspective that can add more value to security as an apparatus?
Yeah, I think GRC, or I should say like any security standard out there, let me add some more caveats. Most security standards out there should be seen as like the minimum bar for the company to achieve, right? Companies that get breached have a litany of security standards that they can attest to or have audited, and that having security standards does not make you secure. So I think making sure that it's understood that like, yeah, the standards that GRC is putting forth can be tied to like business development, but that is not where security stops. Like security needs to continue maturing. And I think when you look like at a standard like SOC 2, it's very flexible by intention, and like in its worst form, it is a terrible check the box exercise where you like explain away most of the requirements and get an auditor that doesn't care that much, and you get a meaningless like report. But in its best form, it has like great controls around ongoing risk management, where you need to be constantly assessing your security program and putting in controls that don't exist anywhere in the wording of SOC 2. But if you are following the spirit of what SOC 2 is trying to get at, you'll be constantly finding these risks and putting in like net new controls that, yeah, may never be tested in the audit, but like continue to mature your program the way they need to be. So a little bit of a roundabout answer to your question, but like, I think that's where the like continue added value comes after, after you kind of get the initial certification or report or whatever it is like really following the spirit of what these standards are asking for and continuing to protect your company, do what's right for the customer, by advancing and maturing your security.
Got it. And I want to double click on this. Risk is contextual. And I wanted to maybe, if you can double click on your experience at Cruise, as you were one of the you built the GRC program at Cruise. What did you think about from a risk perspective at Cruise? How was that thought process?
Yeah. So Cruise, for just broader context, was self-driving cars. And when I joined, it was very much an R&D, research and development shop, where any vehicles out on the road, had a safety driver behind the wheel. So our risk profile evolved over time, but the important thing, or I think the biggest takeaway, is the number one thing that we were always focused on, or what we knew the top risk was a remote takeover of a vehicle that would cause the vehicle then to be used as a weapon, drive it into a crowd of people, something like this, and that was always the number one risk on our minds that we were trying to protect against. And so with that, you're literally dealing with human lives, and at the scale that Cruise was looking to get to, a remote takeover of numerous vehicles at once could be a serious large scale terrorist attack, essentially. And so with that came just a lower risk tolerance for anything connected to the vehicle itself. Cruise still wanted to be agile and move as fast as possible. And, we did our best to do that in areas where we could. But, when it came to connections to the vehicle, things like our remote assistance service to help vehicles, out of complicated construction zones or things like this, or, the vehicle network that was hosted in the cloud, they, just had a very low tolerance for security risks. And we would focus a lot on network segmentation and zero trust and the CI/CD pipeline for deploying to those services. And that, is very different from my experience at Whatnot, where we, security is extremely important. We have a lot of user data. We have a active, service that hundreds of thousands of people are using all the time. And, but we don't have people's lives on the line, right? So we can take a different set of risks at Whatnot. We can rely on more detective controls in some instances rather than preventative, if that makes more sense for the business. And I think that context is just really important when you're doing that risk assessment, right? Because you have to match the controls to the company. The preventative controls, have the potential to be more disruptive if they're going to block something from happening, whereas detective controls, you can allow a process to happen and check after the fact to see, see if it happened as expected or not. And so, just important context to match the control to the company, make sure it makes sense, this sort of stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I think that's an interesting switch from Cruise, which is a software-defined vehicle company, to Whatnot, which is a high-speed retail company. And what were some of the learnings that you were able to apply from Cruise into Whatnot?
Yeah, definitely some of the learnings were from early on in my Cruise days, when it was still an R&D company. There was still this sense of, we need to make sure that processes are mature or are secure. And, coming from Dropbox, seeing a relatively mature program, I knew what those processes needed to be. And so early on, I tried to sort of force maturity into Cruise, but didn't take the time to really understand the risk at that time. What I mean by that, is when it was an R&D company, there were safety drivers in all the vehicles. And so we didn't need the full suite of security controls turned on day one, because, even in the worst case scenario of a remote takeover of a vehicle, the safety driver just pulls the vehicle over and turns the car off, right? And you've mitigated your risk. So, one simple example is just access reviews, right? a typical like security control that you must do for any security standard really, but they can be like really onerous, time consuming, especially early on in a company when access has been given like pretty widely, and trying to get crews to like immediately start picking up and like doing access reviews for a lot of their applications just got a lot of pushback. And when you take the time to like sit down and think about it, like it wasn't like there wasn't great justification for why we need to do these like full access reviews right now given the broader like risk profile. So anyways, that's definitely like one of the learnings I've taken forward is, match the security controls to the maturity and risk profile of the company. Don't force maturity when the company isn't ready yet. Like maturity is a journey. And like, if you look like a maturity model, there's steps 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, whatever maturity model you're using. And I generally don't advise companies to try to like skip from 1 to 4 or something, like they're steps for a reason. Even if you know what 4 should look like step 4 of maturity should look like, you should probably go through 2 and 3 first to get there, because it's just part of the journey the company needs to go through to like learn and be ready. So.
Okay. And what were some of the unlearnings? What did you have to unlearn from Cruise into whatnot?
Yeah. I think forgetting some of the, I'll say like size, I guess, was important. Like even when I first joined Cruise, we were roughly a 30-person security team, I think. And so, at that scale, you have at least a few people in each domain of security focused on their area. And that's great. But what it means also is like there's just less sharing of resources, right? You don't necessarily need the GRC person like doing helping out with detection and response, or like helping work on like cloud security. And so, but at Whatnot, that's very different, right? We're like a team of 6, and we share resources across all the different security domains. I help out IT, I help out, in cloud security, in detection and response. And so, just making sure that we've breaking down the, silos kind of has a taboo, but, for lack of a better word, like silos that crop up as you scale, as you grow to bigger companies, and like moving back to like a flatter structure.
Okay. And I'm assuming that to your earlier comment, because you see GRC as an oversight function and it can look at a holistic, I think you use the word scaffolding. I think you are in the best possible position to look at this holistically as well.
Yeah. I think, one of the things that we often did at Cruise that I would like to do like differently at Whatnot is teams, the different like subdomains within security were really like completely responsible for setting their own roadmap, and then would sort of like share that out with the broader team. And I don't think like GRC had as big of a role as it should have, or like what I came to like realize in hindsight over time. And to be clear, I think teams need to be in charge of their own destiny. No team or nobody understands like better the risks in front of them, or like what needs to be focused on, than the subject matter experts. So, I'm not saying like GRC should dictate the roadmap of AppSec or InfoSec or something, but we do understand like what the maturity of those different domains look like. And I think GRC should have like strong input into those roadmaps. And like that's definitely part of what I want to do at Whatnot is be much more plugged in with those domains, working with the like leaders of each area, and helping shape that roadmap over time. Yeah.
Proactive GRC.
Yeah.
What do you see as some of the organizational challenges that typically you see GRC teams facing that they need to overcome?
Yeah. I think budget like is always budget can always fluctuate, right? Like based on how the business is doing. The like both headcount or like headcount budget and like tools budget fluctuates, but maybe this might overlap with it with another area a bit, but what I see is like short term prioritization over long term scale being a challenge. So what I mean by that is like, and I'm guilty of it myself, an easy thing to do is like as a GRC practitioner is like keep your head down, pass the audits, make sure the controls are successful, and like don't cause problems for leadership, and then you've done a good job, right? And that's great, but what that often winds up with is like manual controls or just kind of like sticking things together to like pass the next audit, and it causes processes that like really should have been automated to stay manual like way longer than they should. And I see both like in programs that like I've run and in talking to other partners, a hesitancy for GRC to ask for like engineering resources. And I think there's maybe a few different reasons for it. But yeah, I think GRC should be like encouraged to ask for either just like an engineering contractor for like 6 months, or like see if we can borrow an engineer from another team for a quarter or a trimester to like automate several controls. If there's concern, that there's not enough work for a true full-time engineer, fine, but that shouldn't then like preclude us from asking for a contractor for a certain amount of time, or borrowing resources, because yes, just like as you scale, to set up processes where people are not going to be frustrated, where people are going to like be like, wow, this was like well designed by GRC and like thought out. You need the automated controls, and just putting like a dedicated engineer on it is what's needed.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you see GRC as much an engineering discipline as it is a functional discipline.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Like I think it's starting to become more and more popular, but like having an engineer, a full-time engineer or multiple even, within the GRC team is like absolutely important, and like, and it can bring a lot of value to getting GRC teams out of manual processes. Yeah.
And which goes back to your earlier statement, which is that you have to look at the spirit of what these standards are and these controls are, right, rather than the letter.
Yes.
Okay. That makes sense. What do you see as GRC team's role with respect to auditors, and how should we think about it? How should we approach it?
Yeah. I think the relationship between like GRC team and auditor is undervalued or overlooked sometimes. And I come at this from the perspective of having been the auditor as well. So a couple of things. One, like be friends with your auditor, right? Like you and your auditor are on the same team is really how you should be thinking about it and looking at it. And I mean that even just down to like treating your auditors as like good people. Take the time to like do an offsite with them, go out to dinner, and spend a little time with them, because one, like auditors have some of the widest breadth of experience for how controls or processes have been done across companies, like similar companies. And so, being able to like tap in and leverage that expertise to help you help your own company like understand how can a given control or process be done like well, what has the auditor seen in the past, is really important. And then the other thing is just like having that transparent relationship or like positive relationship with your auditor lets you be more transparent about like issues that might come up. And honestly, like it even just like makes like pushback in an audit from potential finding go so much easier. When you're like discussing a potential deviation or finding, there is like some implicit trust that is built when you have like a positive relationship, when you've been transparent in the past, and auditors are much more willing to work with you, help you solve the issue to like come to a to avoid a finding or something, than sort of just like giving you the default like this failed. Here's your finding. So
You had mentioned to me when we were talking that um, I think you would be prudent in auditor selection. Am I reading too much into it? How do you do it?
yeah, 100%. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier as well about SOC 2 can be a wonderful standard with that does a great job guiding a security program, or it can be like a paper exercise that doesn't mean much. And the auditor has a huge piece in that. I think our like industry as a whole is actually like coming up against an issue where SOC 2 is getting watered down more and more. A lot of these more just like check the box reports are coming out that don't mean that much. And yeah, in my opinion, that like comes back to the auditor, right? Because auditors have a lot of discretion around what is like considered acceptable in terms of meeting the points of focus within SOC 2 and the rigor to which those controls are tested. I've seen SOC 2 reports where they called it a type 2, but when you like look through the testing steps, they just did a test of design for every single one. Like there was no test of effectiveness, there was no sampling. And so I'm like sitting there scratching my head, like what happened here? Like what's going on? So I mean, ultimately, I would love to see the AICPA come out with like stronger standards that auditors are held to, because I think anybody asking auditors even to self audit themselves just isn't going to happen or isn't realistic. But yeah, all that to be said, you should pick an auditor that is going to uphold some level of like rigor. Will push back on you sometimes because if you are just getting SOC 2 for the sake of like putting the SOC 2 seal on your website, you're doing it wrong. Like you should like, yeah, you're watering down like the whole industry and like you're making it worse for all of us. And getting pushback from auditors is a good thing, right? Like that's helping you mature your security program. You should be looking for an auditor that challenges you.
Well said. Our audience has GRC, security, engineering, and possibly IT as well. Maybe it will be helpful to define test of design and test of effectiveness briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, test of design versus test of effectiveness is basically the difference between a type 1 report, SOC 2 type 1 and SOC 2 type 2. So test of design is a point in time test of a control. So just like on the day the auditors show up, can you prove, like we pick change management for a reason, can you prove that all your changes were actually like peer reviewed and approved and tested correctly? Sorry, I shouldn't say all your changes. One change, one change that is picked. Can you prove that one change was actually approved and tested as expected? And that's test of design. Like, did you design a control according to the control stated? Test of effectiveness is, did that control actually work effectively, operate effectively over a period of time? And that's type 2, right? So if you're doing 3 months, 6 months, year report, whatever it is, the auditor is going to sample a bunch of changes over the last, over that time period, 12 months. And you need to prove every single time for every single sample that it actually worked as expected, which is much, much harder to do, right? Setting up a process that always works, rather than cherry picking a good example to prove that it works in theory by design. So
What do you see as some of the technical challenges that the GRC teams face?
yeah, I think a lot of like traditional GRC practitioners don't have like a ton of software engineering background. Even myself, I'm not a software engineer by trade, but I've learned a lot over time where I can, spend a good amount of time in GitHub and, be figuring things out myself now. But I think one of the technical challenges is literally just like technical ability, right? I think the ability to recommend good controls that are automated, can scale, that like fit well into the overall architecture, requires really like a comprehensive understanding of software engineering fundamentals from like, okay, what does your infrastructure look like? Are you on Kubernetes? And like, if so, what's the like, container image that's being used for that versus like if you're on your own stack and you need to control all the way up from like bare metal, you're looking at a very different like set of controls. And even just like taking the time to understand how different systems like interact with each other. Like at Whatnot, we use Snowflake as one of our data warehouses, but understanding like, okay, how does our data actually get from our backend systems into Snowflake? And like, do we need like checks or like controls on that ETL pipeline? Is important. Otherwise, you're like only kind of looking at like an input and output and missing how the data gets from one place to another.
Okay. I think you said something very interesting when we spoke last, Kieran. You said you don't buy into this argument of speed versus security. You don't think that they don't have to be at odds. You don't think security is a gating function. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the like classic security and business like dichotomy, right, is that security is going to make the business go slower. And while it's obviously possible, that's why it's like, one of the classic issues, I don't think it has to be that way, or it shouldn't be that way when security is done right or done well. And so, thinking about when we're thinking about controls, I think putting in place controls that are as low friction as possible, or even make things more efficient for the business is really, really important. And so, a couple examples there is like MFA. It's a it's a very basic security control that's going to be non-negotiable. We're going to need MFA, and like if you do it wrong, it's going to be a pain for everybody. And so that might be if you're doing like one-time passcodes or like SMS text codes, even like pushes to your phone are like both less secure but also like annoying for people to answer. And so like that's going to create just friction in the process. But if you put MFA in place where you're using like biometrics or some form of phishing resistant WebAuthn, or you've got like a YubiKey or your fingerprint or Face ID, it becomes like both more secure and way easier for users to authenticate when they just use their face. They're already looking at it, and they can get in that way. Another example might be with like change management. I think getting peer reviews, is a pretty ubiquitous control, even apart from security. Pretty much every company does peer reviews on changes just because it's good practice. But making sure you have a really easy and like accessible process for people to push emergency changes that don't require peer review, and that you can get alerted and like check after the fact if if something gets pushed that way. Is another example of like you're still covering your risk by having a detective control in there, but you're also letting the business like move fast when they need to and not being a blocker or disruptor by allowing changes to be pushed without an approval. There's access examples as well of like setting things up to be self-service with preset rules about who can be pre-approved for different access, even like beyond RBAC, right? RBAC is a great start, but even beyond that, you can set up like automatic rules so that like an example would be for an admin break glass function, we have it tied to a PagerDuty rotation at Whatnot. So these people don't have access to admin all the time, but the PagerDuty schedule for the person that's on call can grab the admin access if they need it to solve a problem. Super low friction, addresses the security risk of just having a bunch of admins all the time.
Well, that is very interesting. And I think you have also been a big proponent of using GRC beyond the natural sense of controls, like right-sizing access. Can you talk about that a little bit about for our users audience?
Yeah, I think GRC, particularly at smaller companies, although I think it should hold true as you get larger. Although I understand that like a lot of GRC's time just gets taken up with audits as you get to larger companies. But yeah, GRC can really be a function to help mature these basic security controls across the company. So, something like RBAC at a, startup, they may have heard the term, but like it's unlikely to have been implemented well yet. And that's something that like GRC has a lot of experience with, knows how it should look, has possibly like set it up before. And so like that's something I think is great for GRC teams to do, is like integrate closely with IT and like help set up RBAC at the company. And you've like, it does so much good, right? RBAC done right creates so much efficiency for the company because people have the access they need on day one. There's no like, just so much less people are running around trying to figure out what they need and how to get it. And at the same time, like drastically reduces over provisioning of people just saying like, here, have admin because we don't actually know like what access makes sense. And so, yeah, just, it's something that works so well hand in hand. And like I'm a huge proponent of using some GRC time to not just consult on these best practices, but like use it and do them ourselves. Yeah.
Well, that's brilliant because I don't know if you know this. Kubernetes has this command line utility called can audit. It started as an open source project where they are basically looking at your access logs and trying to determine whether the roles are right sized, right,
Yeah.
when the user accesses. So actually, that's a brilliant way to think about this problem. I think this brings me, this analogy that you're talking about, speed versus security, is also very interesting because it brings to my memory DORA, the DevOps research and assessment, where they're basically challenging this notion of velocity versus stability. And they're saying they don't have to be at odds at each other, right? You can achieve both from a development.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I think when done right, they should work together. Like you can have security and speed. You can, have a good DevOps process that works well quickly. But it does like, you have to take a sec to like think about it and just like be willing to like be creative, right? Like sometimes you have to move away from some of the like most traditional implementations of a control.
That is a good segue because you also earlier talked about balancing between preventative and detective controls. I want to double click on that. How do you think about this, Kieran?
Yeah. So, every company is unique, obviously, and like you're gonna have your own risk profile, but the not in the hierarchy of controls, right? Preventative are the best, like most like generally strongest controls. You stop something from happening entirely. And detective controls are generally like on the weaker side because the issue or whatever it is would have already happened and you're finding out after the fact. But that doesn't mean that like preventative is always the control you want to push for. Right, when you do a risk assessment, you determine your like inherent risk there and then figure out, what your target risk is or what your, what your residual risk that you want to get to is. And if, two detective controls get you to your risk target, like there's a good chance that winds up being better for the business than like one preventative control. And so, if we use an example, like it might be something like Terraform configurations where we could put a preventative control in place that stops somebody from like pushing a change without approvals from 3 different teams that that all have their hand in this. And yeah, fine, but like that creates lots of opportunities for things to slow down. People are out and there's a lot of back and forth, etc. Whereas you can have a detective control and you're able to like still be notified that something happened, something changed, and follow up if it is of interest, but nobody is nothing's being blocked because somebody was like out for a long weekend or like out on PTO, or like wants to have like an in-depth like a conversation about some like semantic point of it. Like that conversation can still happen, but while the business is able to move forward with the change that needs to happen. So.
That's a beautiful example. The Terraform example is a beautiful example. But in order to do this, what type of culture do we expect to create?
Yeah, you definitely need, and I I understand that you can work hard to create like a culture of GRC, of trust within the GRC team, but like there's a broader company culture that you have to deal with as well. But anyways, I think what's really important is like a culture that is not afraid of failure or like encourages failure and iteration, right? I think like one of the best ways to like quickly understand what the right control is and how to right size your response to a risk is iterating quickly. Put a control in, and based on the feedback you get, whether it's too onerous or nobody complains, you get that feedback very quickly. But the company has to be very like open and okay with things going wrong or like failure essentially, and not hold that against you. Like I'll use an example where I last week turned off access for a permission, and I wasn't like, basically it would have probably taken me like weeks to fully understand all the implications of this role and everything that was going on, but I knew it was like way over provisioned. And so rather than spending like weeks looking at all the access logs and where everything is going and how all the permissions correlate, I started like taking away access, and then someone from marketing like very quickly pings me and is like, hey, like I don't have access to approved push notifications anymore. And I'm like, oh, sorry, like this is me. And but their response was like, you don't need to be sorry. Like we're super happy to like help you test. And like, thanks for like addressing this quickly. And like that sort of response or like culture lets me iterate on these controls, right size that access in like, I was able to do it in like 20 minutes instead of spending weeks trying to find, what the right solution there was. So.
I would love to get a poll out to our audience on that question in terms of how they feel. I'm sure it's gonna be all over, but that's a fantastic and an interesting sort of experiment, right? I think what you're basically saying is the culture of experimentation, culture of risk taking, right? As long as you can act on it and the intent is right, can.
Yes. And I mean, like, again, you always had to use caution. Like I probably wouldn't do a permission change like that if I knew it was going to affect, like our frontline customer support agents' ability to like give refunds or something, because that's just like a high volume thing that they need to be able to do. I don't want to mess with that. But yeah, like this permission, I was like, okay, like the worst that can go wrong is I disrupt like push notifications that are scheduled in the future anyway. So I'm like, okay, like let me go for this and like see where we are.
You talked about earlier about GRC being a profit center versus a cost center. And for the GRC manager who is trying to build a business case, right, and learning everything that you're saying, Kieran, today, and they want to build a GRC program, how should they think about building that business case?
Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I would go directly to the sales or like business development team to understand where the business is trying to go, understand from leadership or, internal company resources, whatever it is, what the larger business objectives are. Definitely talk to legal as well, and compile basically all the different what are catalysts for where GRC is needed. And, so on the sales or like business development side, that may be like new customers or like markets that you're trying to address. On the business objective side, that may be, generally about like customer trust or going public, right? Like then SOX would matter. There's standards for if you are running ads on your site. There's MRC. Now I forget, was like Media Ratings Council or something. I forget exactly what it stands for, but like, in order to like get advertisers to be comfortable running ads on your platform, MRC is going to matter. So like, like if you see okay, we're going to start running ads on the business objectives. If people aren't already aware that like MRC is probably going to come up and we should get a head start on that, that's where you need to plug in. And then on legal side, right, third party risk often ties in like closely with legal. SOX again is like relevant for legal. And so the compiling all these things and then tying dollar numbers to it, right? The total addressable market value from the new business development, I completely spaced on the privacy regulations in the in the legal sphere, right? GDPR, CCPA, et cetera, like are huge for from the legal perspective that we need to focus on. So like understanding what the potential costs avoided there would be, right, in terms of fines. And anyways, then you can put together like a very clear business case of like doing XYZ gets us or saves us this amount of money. And then you've, sounds very nice in theory, definitely harder in practice, but you've essentially put together like your pitch of like, this is the profits revenue that like GRC can help the business generate.
Okay. Oh, that's beautiful. What would you, if there is a dream GRC solution, what would that look like? Kieran?
Yeah. I want a GRC solution that is as customizable as possible to automate not just evidence collection, but a lot of times the like operation of controls, right? So like if we are using change management as an example again, I want a solution that is not only going to monitor for when a change is pushed in GitHub without an approval, but I want it to then follow up with that PR author and be like, hey, in Slack ideally, or wherever we're working, meet people where they are. Hey, I saw this PR was pushed without an approval. Like, was this intentional? And essentially, have a call and response with them to address that finding. I don't just want like a screenshot or something of the change to like say, this change got pushed. I want that automation, and at the end, collect the evidence for me. If I'm continuing with the examples, a GRC solution where if for access, right, if we are looking at an access review, it should be able to like connect in with Okta, assuming Okta is your SSO, and tell me the last time people signed in to a given application, so that as part of the data for the access review, you understand who's inactive, right? And be able to provide that information then to the reviewer. Like, hey, you have these 16 people to review, 5 of them haven't actually logged into this application in 45 days, and they should have that context as part of their review. Anyways, these are my dream things.
No,
in a GRC
I think
tool.
what you're saying is very interesting. What you're basically saying is that you're saying GRC beyond sort of telling what we do into more a conversation that you're having with the control owners and the rest of the organization. You're basically helping them to move from the baseline, get better from the baseline as much as possible, incrementally, step by step, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, improving from the baseline step by step, and and meeting people where they are, I think, is the other thing that I would say is really important. Teaching people who are like trying to get people to use yet another tool is difficult, and you're probably going to wind up spending more of your time, right, chasing people down than getting like results out of them. So something that's built into Slack or email or whatever it is, where they can just answer like yes or no and like give you the evidence you need, or perform their control right there. Like that just saves both parties so much time, and it's better for security because you're like getting the control to happen like more quickly and more efficiently. So.
No, absolutely. It sounds like a compliance code marketing pitch, but that's another discussion. I think we are almost at the end of the segment. Kieran, and I wanted to ask you, are there any podcasts, books you read, people that you follow, anything that you want to share with our audience today?
Yeah. I think I don't know. Maybe you'll have them on at some point. If you haven't, you should. But Troy Fine on LinkedIn, I recommend that everyone should follow. He has great content about the security GRC world, and also like often it's funny. He didn't pay me to say this. I just think his content is worth following, and it's often like very timely about new standards that have come out, or rulings from or guidance from SEC or whatever it might be. So honestly, I think he's a great source. I don't have like one specific book. I would say like I have tried reading a bunch of different books about like risk management and cybersecurity. Definitely have learned some great things. I also have issues with a lot of them. But I would say maybe my broader recommendation is I was actually able to get like a whole bunch of books, like probably like 36 security related books from Humble Bundle one time. For like a very, very reasonable price. And that was the first time I realized that like Humble Bundle does more than just video games. So anyways, just a general like shout out for that. Always be monitoring what's available there. And I think, when you have an opportunity to use that to get a bunch of like resources, you definitely should.
No, that's nice. I mean, I've never heard of Humble Bundle. This is the first time. So.
Oh, okay. Nice. Yeah. It's it's an online like site where they donate like most of their proceeds to charity, but they work with like game publishers or books to offer bundles of games or books at like severely reduced prices. And anyways, but they have a lot of like just great content that goes through it. So.
Oh, this was a fantastic conversation, Kieran. Loved the conversation. So I think you took us through sort of beautifully the GRC world, and I'm hoping we have a better appreciation of the forest and the trees. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Raj. This is a lot of fun. Hopefully people are able to learn something, take something away from it. And I think more generally, just say my door is always open. I love like connecting with people, chatting. So, always happy for people to reach out and talk more.
Thank you for listening to Security and GRC Decoded. We are your go-to resource for staying ahead in governance, risk, and compliance. If today's episode resonated with you, we would love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. To dive deeper into these topics, visit us at compliancecow.com and follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and community conversations. Join us next time as we continue decoding the future of GRC.